and have a think about the ways that plays out in everyday life. Those of you trained in psychology or doing counselling work could say it's common experience to, in my thesis topic, which was on a radical black thinker called Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist by training, French psychiatrist. You know, for him to have black clients who came to him who said they felt inferior. Now, a psychological approach to that is to say, is to deal with it at the individual level and say, well, you have an inferiority complex, and then to diagnose and treat that inferiority complex with a system of counselling or a system of drugs, more like it these days. But sociologists would say, look, you've got to look at the bigger picture here. We live in a society that's highly racist, that has views, deeply held views about the superiority of white people and the inferiority of black people, and that is the basis on which black people are made to feel inferior. We could think of the same, I think, one that you'll be more familiar with, perhaps, or had thought more about, would be if a woman is worried about dieting or her weight or how she looks physically. We know that illnesses like anorexia certainly they have a biological element and a psychological element, but we can see that that's part of the broader culture, that Ethiopian women don't worry about their weight in the same way that white European women do, and we understand that anorexia is linked to notions of beauty as thinness. So there's a gendered aspect, a gendered pattern involved in those illnesses. And that, of course, like all patterns, there are exceptions. There are men who have anorexia, not many, but there's some. There are women who are violent. There are patterns, there are exceptions to every pattern, but in the first instance, sociology as a social science seeks to explain how these patterns operate. We tend also to want to avoid, victim blaming. We don't seek to label people in sociology. We seek to understand their behaviour in the broader pattern. Right? Class and race and gender, the basic social structures. So when we look at drug use, say we looked at use of marijuana in Australia, the things that jump out to a sociologist are, the fact that the market for marijuana is currently about 3/4 of the market for beer and double that of wine. It's a large market. In dollar terms, the average household spends about $329 on wine and about $758 on marijuana every year. But one of those forms of consumption, one of those forms of leisure-based consumption is illegal. And so the people who do it are seen to be deviant. But a sociologist would say that deviance doesn't stem from something in them, it stems from the social norms that are being regulated, in this case the legal norms that exist. And we sociologists can look at this as a research problem in a number of ways. We can start with the individual, we can go and find out where marijuana users live and go and live with them, study them and do an ethnographic kind of exercise, as Becker's famous study in the 1950s of marijuana users did. Or we can look at those broader social patterns and look at the legal regulation of these things. But we're not interested in, so we can look at the individual in terms of how they become a marijuana user, or we can look, but we're not interested in creating a moral panic around drugs. We're interested in how drugs are regulated and what the effects of different forms of regulation are. Who gets to define what's illegal and what's not? Right? What effects does that have? There are 20,000 deaths a year from drinking alcohol, and as far as we know, there are none from marijuana smoking, but one is legal and one is not. Right? And we could do this with a whole range of drugs and what's social and what's socially accepted and not accepted. So sociology deals with deviance. That's where we get the tag that we're into nuts, sluts and perverts. Because sociology has a long tradition of looking at deviant populations, or populations that are defined by the mainstream as deviant, and understanding how they think and how they got that way and what the systems of social regulation are that create those forms of deviance. Again, we look at social patterns from which we make generalisations. Another famous sociological generalisation is that men make up 80% of prison populations and women make up 80% of the populations of mental institutions. Now, on face value, we could take those sort of statistics just to simply say that men are bad and women are mad. But as sociologists, we suspect that there's some other process going on. Right? that if we do systematic or scientific research on the question, what we'll find is that similar sorts of behaviour are being interpreted in different ways. That if a man commits an act of violence, that's more likely to be regarded as a natural expression of his self, of his masculine self, and so he'll be jailed for that offence. Whereas a woman commits an act of violence, she's more likely to be labelled as mentally ill and more likely to end up in a mental institution. So her similar symptoms or similar practices are interpreted in different ways. And we call that, in sociology, using your sociological imagination.
So I'm stepping in quickly and say, when I was talking drugs in lectures and deviance in lectures, I'm not advocating the use of drugs or advocating against them. I'm just pointing out some of the social patterns and some of the contradictions. That said, I also have been talking in this section largely about structures, and the focus has been on structures. We did a bit about class unemployment, and we talked about thin body ideals, gender structures, racial structures that are sexist and racist structures essentially, but they're not separate from the culture. So if you went back and listened to this second section, and if you the section we just went through, then you'll realise that culture comes up again, because the structures shape the culture, which is about ideas, norms and values. So the thin body ideals are cultural norm, the ideals around how men and women should act are cultural norms as well as social structures. The structures are ingrained patterns that recur, and the culture are the ideas, norms and values that grow around them. Even the idea of victim blaming, which I talked about sociology being conscious of. I mean, we live in a culture very largely based on victim blaming, that people who are oppressed and marginalised, typically we look at them, some properties in them as individuals in order to explain why it is that they're in the position that they're in. In the next section we'll just go on now to talk about about connecting, just connecting those the sociological imagination with your own biography and the structures, but keep your eye open for the cultural aspects of all of that too.
And we call that, in sociology, using your sociological imagination. If you want to become a professional social researcher like me, then what you want to do is become a better psychologist or social worker or environmental scientist. So that's the other reason you're doing sociology in your course. And so we want to help you get some skills to think like a sociologist, because it will make you better at what you do. And it's also a good way to understand about yourself, to become a more reflexive citizen and participate in the world by reflecting on your own behaviour. So, we start with your story. We can start with a biographical story and say, this is my life, and we routinely tell this sort of story to people. But then, if you have a conversation with people, you'll find that first thing you really want to know is a bit about their history, about their past. How did you get to be here? But in sociology, it's kind of the same. When we look at a social issue, at its history. How did it get to be like this? Let's take it back to a time when it wasn't this way. And that helps to break down the idea that this is just the way it is, or it's just the way it has to be, or it's just common sense, or it's just natural. All of those kind of explanations don't cut much ice in sociology. What we're looking for is some sort of historical explanation. Then we look at structures. The main ones are class and race and gender. How does class or economics impact on this question? How does it look from the point of view of a working class person? What points of view are we routinely exposed to, and how might that look different if we took the view of a different social class? What about, what if you were born the opposite gender? How much impact? Obviously it would have a profound impact, not just on yourself as a person, at a personal level, but a profound impact on the sorts of, more than likely, the sorts of jobs that you do, the sorts of ways you interact with people, the sorts of expectations you'd have that would be put on you. And likewise for race. If you were born to the other race from the one you were born to, then your life experience would be profoundly different.